Hi, good morning. I'm Dr. Sheridan Coakes and I'm the National Social Practice Lead here at Umwelt Australia. Before we commence, we would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we each meet on today and pay our respect to elders past, present and future. And today I am joining you from Wanneroo country. Thank you to all that have joined us today for this session. We have had a tremendous response to the webinar invite, and we hope that this will be the start of many more conversations around SIA in New South Wales and more broadly around the country. I've been working in the field of SIA for nearly 30 years now and have been fortunate over those years to work with industry and government across Australia on a range of large-scale development projects where SIA has been integrated as a key component. As a strong advocate of good SIA practice, you can imagine I was thrilled to see the recent release of the DPIE's new SIA guideline, which is now applicable to all state significant developments in New South Wales. While SIA is not new, the level of prescription that we see in the application of the New South Wales SIA guideline is new. There is currently no other state or territory across the country that has the same level of prescription, though we are obviously aware that Queensland does have an SIA guideline, but only relevant to the resource sector. Consequently, it is very welcoming to see the attention that the New South Wales DPIE is providing in ensuring that SIA has a place in the development planning process and around the project decision-making table. This action is also leading to additional developments with the Certified Environmental Practitioner Program Board, CMVP, recently endorsing the development of a specialist certification program for SIA, alongside its impact assessment and other specialist programs such as ecology, heritage and so forth, which is really good news for SIA practitioners such as myself. Having worked in development planning for many years as a social practitioner, it has been very evident to me that SIA, when implemented well, results in better project outcomes and fairer and more equitable decision making. The introduction of the new SIA guidance really reinforces the importance of identifying and predicting social impacts associated with plan change and affords a much better understanding of how such impacts are experienced by those most affected. Projects do result in a range of social impacts being experienced by individuals and communities. And you'll see in the current slide that those impacts may include impacts on people's way of life, their community and or culture, their access to infrastructure and services, their livelihoods, their health and well-being, their surroundings, and their ability to be engaged and influence decision-making processes. Different types of projects may also result in different types of social impacts being experienced. And the new technical supplement that accompanies the new guideline provides examples of social impacts for different development types. As we well know, the costs and benefits of projects are not always evenly distributed, and therefore it is the role of SIA to determine how such impacts may be more effectively managed, mitigated, or positive impacts enhanced through project design and or strategy development. Ensuring that government is provided with an understanding of the likely extent of social impacts associated with a project, and that these are equally considered alongside environmental and economic inputs to enable much better project decisions to be made. Today, we are very fortunate to be joined on the panel by representatives from government and industry that have been involved in the development of the guideline, and also those that have or are currently applying SIA in their respective project developments in New South Wales. For John Watson, the General Manager of Environment and Community at Glencore Coal Assets Australia, SIA practice is not new, with Glencore having a history of integration of social impact assessment in EIAs across a range of Glencore projects in New South Wales. SIA guidance for the extractive industry sector has been in place since 2017, but John and his team have been undertaking SIA as part of project planning for long before the first guideline was in place. For others, such as Rebecca Meek, who joins us from RES, whose company has a new presence in New South Wales, the SIA guidance now applies to RES's current projects, and Bex and her teams are busy navigating a very busy development context in key renewable energy zones across New South Wales. We are also incredibly pleased to have Dr. Richard Parsons with us today, who's been a key driver of the introduction of SIA guidance within DPIE in 2017 and the new guidance this year for all SSD projects, and who, like myself, as a passionate social scientist, has strongly promoted the role that SIA can play in planning and decision-making over the years through his previous roles with CSIRO, through his consulting practice, and most recently within DPIE with his team of social specialists. So myself and my fellow panel members are no newcomers to the inclusion of SIA practice, and we hope that the discussion today may be helpful to those where social impact assessment may be a more recent introduction to their development planning journey. So it's time to commence our panel discussion today, where we will pose a number of questions relating to the development of the guideline, how industry has or is responding to the guidance and the challenges faced, as well as discussing some of the benefits of SIA. How has social impact assessment resulted in improved management and mitigation of impacts, as well as the enhancement of positive impacts, bringing greater benefits to local communities? If you'd like to post some questions of the panel, please submit your questions via the questions tab on the live stream page, and we will do our very best to get as many to as many of those as possible during the session. So let's start with a few questions in relation to the driver for guideline development. My first question, I guess, is best directed towards you, Richard, about what has been the driver of the SIA guideline for government, and what is DPIE hoping to achieve from that increased guidance?
Well, thanks, Sherry, and thanks for the great introduction, and great to be here on this panel. And I'd like to acknowledge the Widjabul people of Bundjalung country here in the beautiful Northern Rivers. Look, I suppose as a representative of the regulator, it would be remiss of me not to point out that a key driver is, of course, the fact that the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act 1979 requires the consent authority for any state significant developments to consider social impacts, among other things. So it's in the Act there, it's a legislative requirement to consider social impacts. And indeed, the first object of the Act starts off by saying that that object is to promote the social and economic welfare of the community. So every planning process that we go through with regard to state significant development has to consider the social and economic welfare of the community, as well as, of course, environmental sustainability. But of course, what does this actually mean in practice? There's been a gap, if you like, about translating what the Act says into practice. And so there's been, over the years, there's been confusion about what the department expects or requires in terms of the scope, methods, or indeed overall quality of social impact assessment as part of environmental impact assessment. So really the key driver has always been to fill a policy gap with a view to achieving consistently high standards of SIA over time. And of course, getting SIA reports into the department that the consent authority can rely on as fair and accurate representations of the likely social impacts of each proposed development. Now, of course, the 2017 guideline was a start in filling this gap, but it only applies or applied to resources projects, has been used voluntarily by other development sectors, but was only a requirement for resources. So really, the new guideline is simply a natural extension of that, and an attempt to have a consistent framework across all development types. In particular, the department has recognised that infrastructure projects in particular have had massive impacts across New South Wales, but particularly in Greater Sydney, of course, but in other places too, have had massive social impacts on people. And there's obviously a sense that if you, as a community member, are experiencing a development project, it doesn't really matter whether it's a mining project or a wind project or a motorway or a prison or a hospital or whatever it might be, if you're impacted by noise or whatever it might be, your well-being is harmed in the process, or indeed you're not experiencing benefits or you are experiencing benefits. It doesn't really matter who the proponent is. We need a consistent framework. So the real driver is to have that consistency across the board. And just on
that, sorry to interrupt there, Richard. We just had a question pop in on the feed, which has said, what has changed between the 2017 and the 2021 guideline? Is there much change between those two?
Good question, and really there isn't a huge change in terms of the overall approach, and that's because the approach and the methodology draws significantly on international guidance. When we started this process of developing guidance back in 2016, it was always a fundamental starting point that we would use international guidance as what is already being used as leading practice, and has been developed over 25 years. And adapt that to the New South Wales context. So that meant that translating the 2017 guideline to the 2021 guideline has not involved huge changes conceptually. Really, the changes are more about some tweaking at the edges, and also tailoring it to different development types so that we can be a bit more specific about what other sectors need to know in terms of their likely social impacts. And also scalability is a big thing. So we've built in quite a lot of guidance about how to scale the extent and therefore the cost, obviously, from an industry point of view, the cost of a social impact assessment process to different scales of development.
Yeah, and I guess too, I think one of the things has been in the past, you've got quite hefty SIA documents come in. So I guess it's also making sure that the outcomes of social impact assessment is able to be, readily absorbed by the community. So trying to be quite concise, I suppose, in what we're trying to communicate. So I noticed that there is some discussion around that in the guideline.
Yeah, absolutely. Conciseness is really important because, to be honest, it's not really the best situation if the department gets an 800-page SIA, and indeed, yeah, from a community point of view, of all the documents within an environmental impact statement, the one that we want affected communities to be able to read and understand and engage with most of all is the SIA, and so it really does need to be in plain language and easily understandable and representing the interests, concerns and aspirations of those affected communities. So,
I think the other point you raised there, Richard, which is important, is there's obviously been a huge amount in the field of SIA. There's a lot written, and there's also been a lot of guidance that has been provided from organisations such as the International Association of Impact Assessment. So I guess when you were starting out in the development of the 2017 guideline, you had quite a bit to draw on.
Well, that's right. We certainly didn't have to start with a blank canvas. A lot of the work has been done by many academics and practitioners, such as yourself, over many years, and so we wouldn't have to reinvent the proverbial wheel. And a lot of that work was done. But the hardest part was really translating it or integrating it into an existing planning system. Yeah.
Great. Well, I might move on now to the broader panel, and just really a question around how to Bex and also to John, but how has industry responded to the guidance, I guess? I mean, obviously, John, you've been around it for a while because the new guideline was introduced in 2017. But yeah, just, what's been the uptake, and I guess what have you found in working in your particular sectors and on your projects and in your companies? How are people responding to it?
Thanks, Sherry. I guess from a Glencore perspective, the level of, community consultation and social impact assessment has been, a key focus for most of the project modifications that we've put through over the last, 10 to 15 years. And I think back to the 2012 bulk optimisation project, where there was specific early consultation around the development of the visual and noise bund, which directly went out to the community to talk about the construction phases, what that bund would look like, and the feedback from those sessions directly impacted in the final design of what we eventually came up with. And I suppose the community input, the community acceptance, and the willingness of that transparency of the transaction was something that brought a whole heap of acceptance to that local community around the project that was going forward. the concern, not the concern, the issue, I guess, for us is that most of the projects now that we have in the Hunter Valley are modifications of existing projects. So we're not actually going back to start from scratch. And from a Glencore perspective, the only greenfield site that we've had in the last 10 to 15 years was the Mangoola site. So one of the challenges we have is where there is the ongoing consultation process through the operation of a mine, and then we have a modification that we're not necessarily starting from scratch. That's an iteration of that process over time. So that's probably one of the challenges that we have. Another one, and I think it's probably a little unique to the Hunter Valley, is where, for instance, we've got multiple sites sitting really close to each other, consulting with the same or communities and the impacted communities, and the potential for fatigue for those communities. And if I look at, say, that Bulga-Broke area, for instance, you've got, we've had processes for both the Bulga mine, we've had a process for United Wombo, and then potentially there's a MTW process occurring as well. So there's communities being consulted regularly, and it's not necessarily starting from scratch. So it's having that nuance of the right type of consultation and discussion, but also the understanding of those issues and how they've changed over time, rather than starting from a blank page.
And I guess too, John, for a lot of the projects, your projects, you're dealing with quite an educated community around mining. So exactly. Who back in the days when there were a lot of greenfield developments in that part of the valley, it was a different situation. But now you've got a community that does understand the impact and has a good level of knowledge. So I guess in that way, some of the processes that you're talking about that you've put into place are important, because it really comes down to quite close collaboration with those groups around what you're doing. Yeah.
And for mine, I suppose, where we've got, as you say, quite an educated community that we're dealing with, that those processes over time have informed how we scope and develop our projects. So there's a lot of pre-work done in the first instance, because, whilst it's not necessarily a question about noise impacts, the feedback may be a very direct question. Is, what is the increase in noise at my property? So we know there's noise, but what is the specific issue or the specific impact likely at my property, which is a lot further along the chain than, oh, hang on, noise. What do you mean noise? And having to go through that whole discussion, because people are quite aware of policies around air quality or noise or those types of things. So that, I guess, puts a higher threshold on ourselves to make sure that when we are consulting that we've taken those into account. And I think when we look through the range of projects that we have completed over the last 10 years, that those learnings are then taken forward on each new project, so that we are going with a much, a fuller, I guess, assessment to the community, and people are aware of how we act as well. So there's a level of expectation of what will be presented in the first instance when those initial consultation phases are taking place.
And I think that's a really good point you make there, John, that, once you've embarked upon good solid SIA practice as part of your process, there is that expectation created in your community for that greater involvement and engagement around different social impacts. So obviously, in terms of Glencore's development and Xstrata before that, you've been doing it for a long time now, and as you said, building on that. Bex, I might just turn to you. What's been, as a relatively newcomer to the New South Wales development context, and obviously, a very important sector. We've all heard all the discussions around renewable energy, and we know there's some key renewable energy zones currently being developed within New South Wales. What's been the response of RES to the new guidance, the new social guidance?
Okay, thank you, Sherry. Well, Well, as you say, slightly different to John. We're walking into a very new environment. There's a very big education piece for us as an industry and also us as RES to go into these communities and let them understand what having wind farms and solar farms in their area means. So in terms of the community engagement side, I think as an industry and especially RES, we've always been quite proactive in terms of community engagement. But what the guidance has really done for us is brought the community engagement much earlier in the process.
Yeah.
It's also sort of widened the people that we go out to, and it's just ensuring that we, have a much wider and more diverse section of the community having a voice in terms of our development. But it's really given us some structure around how we engage with the community, how we engage with stakeholders. And as an industry, it's sort of been the stepping stone with the introduction to have a number of working groups created. So as an industry, we have the Clean Energy Council where we can sit around and discuss best practice for us as an industry as well. But I suppose bringing forward the community engagement side of things, as we're walking into a greenfield site, we've got a lot of work to do on these projects before we have sort of any idea in terms of what they look like. And it's quite difficult to open up those conversations with the communities. And when they say, where are you going to put that turbine, or where are the roads going to go? We don't have those answers. And it's trying to get that genuine consultation so that they understand we're not just trying to be go behind their backs, and we do know what's happening. It's genuine. We don't know what's going to happen or what it's quite going to look like at this stage. But I suppose coincide with that, it means that there is that opportunity for the communities to actually see that feedback loop. We can really do genuine consultation, at that early stage. We can understand what their needs are. And we've recently been out into the Central West, where we've got a couple of projects and going out to the near neighbours, to the host landowners, to all the community. We're understanding what some of the key issues is. A big one is where, construction workers will stay. It's quite a tourist area. They don't want all the local places being filled up with workers that will be there for a couple of years and then disappear, and they've missed X, Y, and Z from coming into the community that would go every year. So, points like that are really good for us to understand now and build into our plans and into how we develop the projects. And yeah, that's sort of what we're finding. And we're pleased to have some guidance to help us as well.
And that's a good point you raised there, Bex, because early engagement is a key aspect, isn't it, Richard, of the guideline? There's been a real push for I guess in the guideline for applicants to get out early, to start talking. And I think the point you make there, Bex, about not having all the answers at the beginning, and I think that's sometimes scary for industry when they first head out with their project, because you don't have all the answers. And but the opportunity that's provided by having that early engagement and early identification, if you like, of social impact is really valuable, isn't it, Richard, in terms of the ability, I suppose, to inform project design and work and demonstrate that it is a process and that the community is on the journey with the applicant in that process.
Yeah, I would agree absolutely, Sherry. I think that well, firstly, the emphasis on early engagement is something that's broader than just SIA as well. So the department is trying to encourage early engagement across the board for all parts of environmental impact assessment to help ensure that projects are community informed, if you like, or informed by communities' concerns and aspirations. But clearly that relates mostly to the SIA, or specifically to the SIA, which is why we've got the section in the guideline about community engagement activities that are specific to SIA as opposed to more broadly.
Yeah.
And look, I would absolutely agree, and similarly, I've heard lots of times the concern that going early, it feels like a risk. It feels like, or what do we do when people say, but where are you going to put those turbines, or where is the tailings dam going to go, or whatever it might be. And if you haven't got that into your design yet, then clearly it's not easy to answer that question, because you might say, well, we think it might go over here, but it might go over there. And then people, of course, get anxious, or they get nervous, and they think, well, why don't you know what you're doing? But I would suggest that this presents a real opportunity, because what it means is that you can show that you haven't necessarily finalised your plans before you're having these conversations, and that you can have a conversation with the community to say, well, look, this is broadly what we're aiming to do. We want to have a project here. We haven't exactly finalised all the locational aspects of it, haven't exactly finalised the design, and we've got some broad objectives, but can we sit down and have a conversation about how this project can most closely speak to the values and aspirations of this community? So I think to me it's a reframing that presents an opportunity by bringing communities in earlier in the conversation. I recognise it's not always easy, and you're always going to have people who've got the loudest voices and those kind of community dynamics to negotiate, but it can be done.
And just on that, Richard, what are you seeing? Are you seeing in when you're looking at some of those social impact assessments in your team, across your table, in DPIE, are you seeing that the SIA is being used to inform design? Are you seeing that sort of correlation, if you like, between social impact and how those have been incorporated in the projects?
We are, yes. It's still early days, of course, at the moment. Yep. But yes, we are beginning to see that direct line of sight between outcomes of community engagement and of course social research, which is equally important to outcomes of engagement, in informing the design of the project. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean that every aspect of a project can be informed in that way, but if there are aspects that can be refined in response to community wishes and optimizing social outcomes, then yeah, we are beginning to see more of that coming through. But obviously it is early days. The new guideline only really takes effect on the 1st of October. So I'm anticipating that we'll see more of that over time. And we're keen to work with proponents to help to help have these conversations about how to do it most effectively.
Yeah, which is great. So let's move on. There's a couple of questions coming in around sort of the benefits. There's a question here around, what are some of the benefits of SIA that you've noticed on your project? So that's a question largely to Bex and to John. So either from the process of developing the SIA or project outcomes, and I guess you've touched a little bit on that, both of you actually, in different ways. But if we can just pull out a little bit more information from you around how you see those SIA, the benefits of SIA have helped your projects that you've been involved in. John, do you mind starting off on that one?
Yeah, look, I think for us, it sets a framework around what SIA is and how it can be assessed. And I think we've had a long history of completing, well, essentially what was part of an EIS, but was this SIA process. And I hark back even to the Beltana project back in the early 2000s, where there was direct consultation around the impact of underground mining on vineyards, and which essentially was the establishment of a trial vineyard over a longwall panel to actually look at the tilt and the stress and strain on those vineyards. And to me, I think it's around, and to me, the principle of what we started back in those days through the Mangoola and BOP and now the current projects such as United Wombo one is essentially, going out early, understanding what the issues are. And then, as I said before, really understanding that, mine design can be quite technical. So we need to be quite clear around what the majority of that mine design will look like prior to consulting and prior to putting a project forward, because we may go through another 2 to 3 years of detailed assessment of what the final design looks like. So we need to have a fairly good idea. So actually being able to understand, well, what are those key concerns and how is that likely to impact, particularly around noise and air, where there's a concentration of sites, is critical to the success, firstly, to get the approval, and firstly, to be able to actually operate, with the communities close by. So to me, that's where I see the benefit of the SIA process is. I guess the second part of that is then how do we put that into practice once we have the approval, and really, we've got United Wombo as our first site with a SIMP or a social impact management plan, and how do we then start to really look at, well, measure, what we've spoken about through the approval process. So to me, I guess that's the next phase of how that works out, and having some good, clear, sensible targets in that SIMP to really be able to assess is where I think we can actually, I guess, demonstrate a benefit of a process like this to say, well, here's the validation of the work that was done. This is where we're sitting in relation to those targets, and to, I guess, discuss with the communities in those areas, how that will be refined over time, so that, it leads to, I guess, a mutually beneficial outcome for both parties, because most of our sites will run from anywhere from 10 to 25 years, so we are a significant member of the community, and part of that is playing our part within that community as well.
Yeah, and I guess too, John, some of those benefits have been obviously in dealing with some of the technical issues that, like you said, you've been coexisting alongside the viticulture industry up in the valley, and doing a lot of good work with them around impacts of mining on vineyard. But I guess too, there's also the local benefit programs that you've been running, investment programs as well. So I guess it's showing that the identification of social impacts of some of those more environmental issues such as noise and dust and so forth. You've been working with landholders around that, but you're also doing quite a lot in trying to maximise, I suppose, the benefits to local communities as well.
I suppose just one more point to add to that for us, and I noticed it in the guidelines as well, it's about net benefit as well. Yeah. So we're not shying away that there are potential negative impacts that may occur as a consequence of mining, but what's the net benefit of the project? So we have programs around noise and air and those types of things, which are key controls for the operation of a mine. But it's also understanding what's that likely to look like in the community, and it's not just about handing out dollars through a community investment program or contributions to a VPA or whatnot. It's actually understanding what's our net benefit, so that net benefit is positive rather than negative.
But Beck, did you want to have a comment on some of the benefits you're seeing already? Obviously, you're in a different stage of the process, but are you already seeing how, I guess, some of that engagement is giving you some insight into and informing that project design phase?
Yeah, as you say, I suppose we're in the very early stages still, and I think what we've been able to do is we've been able to go out and, as I say, sort of cast the net quite wide to understand what the sort of diverse opinion is across the board on the project. And I think one thing it's sort of allowed us to do, or maybe made us do, is be very forthcoming in reaching out to the stakeholders and to the community. And what I've personally found is we're having good conversations with a lot of individuals in the community, and that's not necessarily just those that are for the development, even ones that have their concerns about it or reaching out to us to ask for more information, to understand and educate themselves on the development. So from our side, at the early stages, it's just allowing us to have that connection with the community where we're not a big bad developer just coming in. Anyone can pick up the phone and speak to Bex from Res and have that conversation. And I think one of the things that's maybe difficult is it's got to be genuine consultation. So the guidance very much gives us a framework to do it, but I think, you know, there has to be that genuine consultation and that genuine desire within the business to do best for the community. But we're definitely seeing the benefits at this stage, and you know, we're at that point in the developments now where we've done our first round of sort of consultation. We're getting all that information back, and we're sort of feeding that into how we design the projects. And taking, you know, the solar farm, for example, we've definitely seen concern on the ways in which farming and agriculture can coexist with the renewables. Wind farms obviously slightly easier. You've only got a footprint of each turbine, then it's business as usual underneath. Whereas solar's a bit different to that in that it takes up a much greater hectares. So we're looking at different ways and drawing from our experience in overseas in the UK and the US on what we can do, whether that's, you know, having sheep underneath the panels, whether it's, you know, looking at native grasslands, bees, all those sorts of things. And we're at a stage now where we've got nothing set in stone, so we can explore all those avenues and really get feedback on what the locals think would be best for the community as well.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, because I think often, you know, in my experience in working in SIA with industry for many years, it's often through that some of those solutions and strategies develop that maybe hadn't been considered before. So it's actually through that the community having that discussion around those potential impacts. Those sort of solutions emerge through that process, and you really get, I guess, ownership over those strategies to better address those impacts. Just on that, Richard, just throwing to you a minute, how are you seeing community stakeholders respond to the improved guidance? You know, do you think it's helping to meet the expectations of communities around participation in project planning?
I think it is going some way to doing that, yes. I mean, obviously any guideline is a government document and it's written in a bureaucratic way, which doesn't necessarily make it very easy for communities to engage with. So you know, maybe we need a community guide separately, but there is actually, I should say, as part of the rapid assessment framework, which came out recently, and the SIA guideline is part of that. There is a guide for communities to engage with the planning system more broadly. So that's something that's, I think, a really great addition to the documents. But yes, I think we are seeing a welcoming from communities, and certainly if the submissions on the draft guideline are anything to go by, we had a lot of submissions from all sectors, but including representative community groups and Aboriginal groups who were really glad to see that the department was taking this seriously.
So are you seeing, I mean, Bex talked at the beginning about sort of the breadth of engagement that RES has been doing, for example, out in the Central West, you know, everyone from sort of host landholders but through to service providers and so forth. Are you seeing in the SAAs that are coming across you know, through your process, that there is that breadth of engagement, that there, you know, I know the community engagement guideline, the new one from the department, and obviously in the SIA guideline too, it talks about that, having that broader engagement, and particularly in that scoping phase, really ensuring that we're talking to all those relevant stakeholders that may potentially have an interest or be impacted by a project.
That's right, and you know, it's the job of my team to critically scrutinise the SIAs that come into the department, and to have a look, for example, at the list of stakeholders that have been engaged or consulted as part of both scoping and the EIS phase, and to ask, is there anything missing here? Has anyone been left out? And we are increasingly seeing really comprehensive lists of stakeholders who have been engaged in the process, and that's really great to see. Obviously, what we're looking for is not only a list of you know, a good identification of who they are, but also what activities have taken place to bring them into those conversations. And so the best SIAs that we're seeing are doing both of those things, showing us who is being engaged and how are they being engaged. And that's why the guidance is in the in that section of the guideline on how to do that most effectively. But of course, there are, as you say, lots of other guidelines out there as well.
Yeah. Do you see, again, Richard, a question to you, which is coming in there. This one just coming here around, there's a strong focus making SIA reports community friendly, but parts of the guideline are more technically focused, which we know, such as the categorisation of impacts. So how do you see the balance for practitioners to both meet the technical SIA needs and make it easy for the community to understand? I think that's an interesting question.
Yeah, that is a really good question. I mean, I think, as I say, I think the guideline has been written mainly for practitioners as the primary audience, but also in anticipating that proponents and the community generally would be able to read it and actually use it as a basis for having a conversation about the project. But I would also like to think that the onus is on practitioners in particular to be the, I suppose, conduit between the proponent and the community in translating that guideline into real language, if you like, and helping communities to understand the nature of the project, the design of the project, and what their rights are with regard to engaging in the EIS.
And it's interesting because I think we've often said that, to be honest, by the time an EIS is lodged with the department, really, from a community perspective, there should be nothing new in there. So, you know, if we have engaged our communities through our SIA programs effectively and our EIS programs effectively, by the time you get to the end, to be honest, the impacts are identified, the community's been involved in that process, the strategies are in place, and then I guess it just comes down to the decision makers to determine, to weigh the costs and benefits of that project. So, you know, communication aspect, you know, if that process has been working well at a community level, yeah, there should be no surprises, I would say, in that document at the end.
Yeah, that's right. There should be no surprises. I would like to think also that also a community member reading that SIA would not only see no surprises, but would also perhaps learn and appreciate a bigger picture about the project than they might have previously considered in individual conversations. So, for example, if someone's main concern about a project is noise, you know, that's mainly an individual concern, but there may be broader impacts and benefits of the project that they haven't necessarily considered. And so, although these things shouldn't be a surprise, what I would expect the SIA to do is to paint that broader picture of the overall impacts and benefits, and also some of the impacts that they might not have thought of, like how a project might affect people's sense of place and how it might affect community cohesion, things that are maybe more intangible and less obvious, but equally need to be a fundamental part, or are a fundamental part of SIA.
Yeah, terrific. I'm going to turn now to some of the questions that are coming in, because they're coming in thick and fast. So I hope that's okay. And we've only got probably about 10 minutes left. So I think if we can turn our attention to some. There's a great one here for John. John, how do all the companies work together around the Broke area to minimise consultation fatigue for the community, and also around cumulative impacts?
Yeah, look, I guess it's a good question for Glencore, you know, in the Hunter region as a whole. There's a couple of things that we do as well. One of the things is realising that one site's performance impacts on another site's performance as well. So we're seen as Glencore across the valley. So for us, there are conditions in terms of cumulative impact. There are regulatory conditions around things like cumulative noise and dust, so and blasting, for instance. So there's interactions between sites on that. For instance, in the Ravensworth area, I know we're talking about Break, but for instance, in the Ravensworth area, we consolidate consultation and information that's provided to the community through process, so Ravensworth, Liddell, Mount Owen, Glendale, Integra, there's almost like one face. There's consolidated community, consolidative committees as well. So, and we're in a slightly different scenario where any changes to those projects or developments are really modifications. So as I was saying earlier, it's an iteration of where we already are. So there is a lot of interaction between our own sites, and to some degree there are interaction with the other operations that are close by, so that we can minimise that. And as I said, for us, it's about trying to understand what consultation needs we do have with our own sites and trying to streamline those so we don't end up with that fatigue issue. Another thing.
Sorry, John, just to jump in there, I think too, in response to that question, you have quite different communities associated with your operations as well, don't you?
Well, that's right. Yeah. So there's a series of communities around the operations, but the Camberwell area is distinctly different from that Bulga-Broke area. Then there's the Mangoola side, but I guess from a regulatory perspective, we're seen as one. We also do a 3-yearly community perception survey, which also, I guess, informs a broader regional assessment of people's perceptions of Glencore as a company, as a community member, and environmental performance as well. And we use that then to look at streamlining some of the ongoing consultation that's done as part of that.
And I know in your Bulga, related to your Bulga operation, you've actually got a mechanism there and ongoing. So as a result of some, your extensive sort of social impact work there, you do a regular barbecue, which actually has become a mechanism that's really run by the community.
Yeah. So 6 monthly frequency. There's a barbecue, one at Broke and one at Bulga. And to me, they're probably the best examples of effective community consultation, because we will have the management teams from the site address the community. There's good access to the ops manager, mining manager, and environment manager as a core group, and any pertinent issues that are raised, and that's a process that's been built up over a few years. We're now using that up at United Wombo as well, and it's a really good way of I guess clearing the air and minimising any misconceptions around what's occurring at the site through those particular sessions, where people, I think, feel their voice is heard as well, that they can actually raise issues directly with the people who can make those changes. And years in another life, I worked at another company that did something similar with its community in the Central West, actually, and that face-to-face interaction with senior members of the management team, I think, when you're in the operational phase, made a significant difference to how those communities perceive the company and the actions that they took.
Yeah, and I think, Bex touched on that too, that, being out and having the community knowing they're actually dealing with those that are making some of those decisions, I think is really important. There's a really good question coming around our COVID restrictions currently, and it really actually is relevant and interested too, Richard, in what's coming through, your view on it from government's perspective. But how are the panel adapting to the ongoing COVID restrictions when undertaking SIA? And I know, Bex, that's been something on the forefront of your mind, so I'll cross to you first. And the second part of that to Richard is how is DPIE going to view that restricted in-person engagement due to COVID when considering applications? So I might go to Bex first, let you think about that one, Richard. But Bex, that's been a challenge, hasn't it, in your program?
Yeah, without a doubt, Sherry. We've found it, difficult. We were meant to be out in the community this week with a few exhibitions going on. Obviously, that can't happen. So we've really had to start looking at means of ways of engaging with the community, all on computers, which in rural communities is a lot more difficult. There's often not very good internet connections. There's people that don't quite have the easy access to Teams, Zoom, and the likes, like we all do here in Sydney. So what we've been doing is trying to get people to sign up to sort of similar to this sort of webinar type events, and we're finding it difficult. We haven't probably had quite as much uptake as we'd hoped for. We did a lot of advertising in local papers, in the contact list we already have, phoning around, all those sorts of things. So it has been difficult, and I think from our side, what it's going to make us do is, we're going to have to try and get that out there as soon as possible. It's much better for building relationships to be doing it face to face than over computers. So it's definitely been difficult, and we've been having conversations with DPIE to sort of understand how this is going to be accepted from your side, Richard, sort of the process we're going through. So yeah, Sherry, it has been it's been difficult, but hopefully we just have to keep going and keep trying to get those communication channels open with the community.
What we have found, before I cross to you, Richard, a lot of people, a lot of that engagement has gone into telephone calls, and we have found people are actually quite willing to stop and chat that way, when obviously we can't do it in person. So we found on a lot of the surveys that we're doing for various clients that we're actually getting really strong response rates on some of that survey work than we would probably normally have got. But Richard, just that question about how is the department going to view that restricted in-person engagement due to COVID when considering applications? Because obviously, we've been had quite a significant period here where a lot of us have been in lockdown.
Yeah, it's a good question, and agree, it is a massive challenge. I suppose the good news is that obviously my colleagues in the department are also real people who've been subjected to lockdowns and the same sort of challenges as everybody else, and so totally appreciate the challenges that we're all facing in terms of trying to do our work in the way that we would like to do it. In practice, what that looks like is that obviously a lot of the activity that we would like to do on the ground is having to be done through other means, and that's tricky. I think though that there is an allowance for that because of what I say. We totally acknowledge that these challenges exist, and so we will be making allowances for what has been possible and what has not been possible. But obviously, we're still looking to achieve the same outcomes, maybe through different means. And so, a lot of practitioners, particularly engagement practitioners, have been very creative in finding new ways of reaching communities, and that's something I would really encourage to explore as many different diverse ways of doing that online and through other means of communication, as many as you can manage. And I think the one thing that we'd be particularly cautious about is obviously there's always more of a risk that someone's going to be left out of the process because you haven't been able to get on the ground. And in SIA, as you know, there's a real need to focus on impacts on vulnerable people. And so what we're particularly going to be looking for is, given those constraints, what efforts have been made to identify who are vulnerable people, why are they vulnerable, what is it that makes them perhaps less resilient than other people to this project, and what are the ways can we have a conversation with them to enable this project to meet their needs or minimise any harmful impacts on them. So it's just trying to find different ways to achieve the same outcomes, but it's particularly, I think, if we can see that you've made a real genuine attempt to identify and engage with those vulnerable groups, then that's clearly, I suppose, an indicator of a successful process.
And I think too, we're seeing, it works on both sides, doesn't it? We're seeing communities actually, I guess, participate in ways that they haven't done before too. And there's obviously been a learning in that for all parties as they engage through virtual means and so forth. But it's good to see, because I think it's opened us up to a far broader range of engagement mechanisms. But as you said, needing to recognise that for vulnerable groups in our community, that they may be more difficult to reach during in that way.
That's right, Sheridan. And look, I'd just add to that indeed, what you can find is that some people who may be less willing to engage in an in-person thing, like a town hall meeting, might be very happy to attend a webinar. And those of us who are more introverted than extroverted, very happy to participate and offer an opinion in something online, as opposed to attending, an event where the loudest voices dominate, because there's a kind of it can be an equalising effect of online forums. So it can work both ways.
Actually, and that's a really good point, because I think this sort of virtual platform does allow equal voice. Whereas, all of us have known who've attended public meetings or town hall events, like you said, sometimes it's those that are more vocal that, as you said, that get the, say more, and those that are less comfortable in those situations saying less. So I agree. I think it's about, as we know, in good engagement practice, it's about matching techniques to people that they're most comfortable with to ensure meaningful participation, but also ensuring we've got a range of mechanisms in our programs. And obviously engagement is a key aspect that informs our SIA programs, and really isn't detached from it. I mean, if we don't engage, we don't better understand people's needs, values, aspirations, impacts, and so forth. There's a really good question here, which we're coming to the end of the session, but I think it's a really important one to ask. That does the panel have any advice on, and this one's been directed at Richard, but I'm actually going to also switch it a little bit and get some advice from Bex and John. Firstly, Richard, do you have any advice on working with clients who keep their engagement and social impact work close to their chests? We have found that we're struggling to get traction and have concerns around meeting the requirements of the guideline. So obviously we've got two clients sitting, two industry applicants sitting here who are quite open to the guideline and what the guideline can deliver. But obviously that's across the board. We always find some more hesitant about applying.
Well, I just briefly, because of time, I would say I would like to think there are two hooks for encouraging better engagement and indeed better SIA. And one is the business case for doing so, which is that you get better outcomes by genuinely doing these things properly. The other is simply an ethical obligation to involve people in decisions that affect their lives.
Yeah. Okay. And John and Bex, what has assisted you in making a business case for social impact assessment as part of your project decision making? Obviously, that having a guideline, I mean, we know as social practitioners, having a guideline in place is really helpful, because it allows us, even though we recognise the importance of the practice, having that in place allows us to work with our clients more proactively to say, look, well, we've got to do this, so let's look at how we do that together. How have you both, and I guess John, for you particularly, firstly, you've applied SIA without any regulatory driver. So maybe to you first, what's assisted
to me,
you?
I think for us, it's inherent in maintaining a social licence to operate, in particular the communities close to where we operate and the region where we operate. But it just makes good sense, and we've seen success with the projects that we've delivered, and to fulfil on those commitments has led to the standing of Glencore as well in the Hunter Valley as being a leader in these areas. And we're proud of that position where we are, and we hold our sites and people to high standards. So I think it sort of goes to Richard's point that we go out early, we know what our projects are, and we're really taking into account people's views around where we are, so that essentially we can end up with a net benefit for our projects in the areas where we operate.
And I think, John, just picking up on a point you've made there, I think the social aspects is very much brought to the table in that decision making. And I know, having been involved with some of your projects, we can very clearly see it's definitely given equal weight as
Absolutely.
you make decisions. Bex, just in terms of you, obviously the guidelines there, and that's a driver, but you've actually commenced this prior to the guideline really being applicable, because there is obviously a bit of a transition period with its application, what's been a driver for your company and your business?
I think the key thing for us, we're a family-owned business. We're in many markets, and one thing that we always want to do as a business is to be good neighbours, and that's one thing that is very much led from the top, that wherever we go, we are good neighbours. And then in addition to that, we've come out of the UK where community engagement is very well run, but also there's a lot more resistance in the UK to these sorts of projects. The main thing being that there's obviously a lot higher density of populations where they're developing wind farms compared to over here in Australia, and the time, the money, in terms of from a business point of view, that having an anti-community is it can kill a project. So we know that we need to be good neighbours, but we also know that we need to have the community on board and very much part of the journey with us.
And I guess it's that starting early, building that trusted relationship is critical. And it's good you both said that it's not just about the project phase, it's about how it extends into the life of the project and the operations over time. I mean, if you start, we know from our practice, if you start in the right way, it does give you that opportunity to work really well with local communities. And that doesn't mean you're always going to agree on everything, as we know, but at least you have that relationship where you can have that conversation, and communities can see the benefits, but they can also see how you're addressing those negative impacts as well. So look, today's been a great discussion. We've got a number of other questions which we're not going to get to, which actually delve more into the detail of the guidelines, so more around the social baseline and sections. So we might look at seeing if we can organise another panel session where we maybe interrogate some of the specific aspects of the guideline a bit more closely. But look, I'd really like to thank our panellists for joining us today. I know, as I noted at the beginning of the session, I hope we continue to have more discussions around social impact assessment. I think it's really important. We know, as I said earlier, that there is a push towards greater certification of SIA practitioners. I think that's absolutely important, particularly for our emerging practitioners in this area. Richard and I both know very well. It's been a long time coming. New South Wales DPIE is definitely leading the way across the country in terms of the development of this guidance and the suite of guidance that's being developed alongside it. I hope you found the session informative. And from all of us, we thank you for listening in for the hour, and we hope that everybody that managed to register got to tune into the session. As with all these sort of sessions, sometimes they work really well, sometimes they don't. So I do apologise if anyone didn't get the email through. But a big thank you again to Richard, to Bex, and also to John for their time today, and look forward to seeing how social impact assessment continues to be integrated as part of your projects. And Richard, hopefully you're going to see some really good quality practice come across your desk. Okay, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sheridan.